So you're in these Times offices here in Chicago. We're in Logan Square. My name is Ari Blumkatz, and I'm the executive editor here at In These Times. And before we get going, I wanted to ask the group here, can someone tell me what the biggest problem is with media in the United States today? What do you got?
Not enough.
Not enough of it, okay? You're a journalist, okay? So not enough of it. We got to give this guy some more work. Okay. Polarization is another one. What else we got? Fragmentation. Okay, excellent. Anybody else? Back in the
egregious use of the passive voice.
egregious use of the passive voice. What about you? Money. Yeah, that's a big problem too. All right, anybody else? Last one. Go ahead. Well, that too.
Inaccurate, no quality control.
No quality control in terms of accuracy. Yeah, that's a big one. So you all are very much on target. However, the biggest problem in American media right now is that not enough people read In These Times. So you all have on your seats places to subscribe. For those of you at home, please go to inthisetimes.com. We are a award-winning publication. We've been around for about 15 years. Last year, we were honored to be named the best independent publication. We got the 2024 Izzy Award for Excellence in Independent Media. We also were honored to win a European Press Prize for an investigation we did in Europe as well. So please, we've got magazines there. Check out our content. Pretty proud of it. We do really great work. We're here to talk about a critical issue that is largely considered forgotten in not only the Jewish community, but in all of our communities. It's a topic many feel forbidden to interrogate and discuss, a topic that carries with it thousands of years of trauma for Jews all over the world. And that topic is money. And today we're specifically going to talk about the intersections of Jewish philanthropy and anti-Semitism. But we're not going to be leaning into old stereotypes and dynamics. This is not a panel where we're going to conflate discussions of philanthropy with anti-Semitism. Hopefully. This panel is designed to surface various issues surrounding how Jewish philanthropy is being used in this moment to shift the moral compasses of our Jewish institutions and communities. Spoiler alert, it's not going well. And in particular, it's not moving our moral compasses more towards justice. This discussion, of course, is critical, and I think we all want to take a moment right now to think about how actually critical this discussion is and the moment that we're in right now. We're in a moment where at least 40,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. Some estimates rise much higher than that, closer to 200,000 right now that have been killed or will be killed soon. This is something that we need to be wrestling with as a community very intentionally, and this panel is very critical in how we are wrestling with that. I'm grateful that tonight's event is organized by the Jewish Liberation Fund. Really honored to be here with Ben Norburn, Ginna Green as well. For those of you who don't know, Rachel mentioned that Ben just published a new book. If you can hold it up for folks, it's Behind Candlesticks that I lent to Ben the other day. Thank you for bringing them back as well. The Jewish Liberation Fund is exactly the type of philanthropy our Jewish communities need. It's the type of philanthropy that is dedicated to justice and to building a multiracial working class movement for change and transformation. It's the type of philanthropy that believes deeply in the Jewish principle that to take one life is to destroy an entire world. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna shut up in a second and just leave it to Ginna and Ben here, but first let me introduce them. Ginna Green is a strategist, a wise guide, a writer and movement builder, and partner and chief strategy officer, at Uprise, where she leads the practice on philanthropic advising within the Jewish community and is a principal strategist for its progressive movement and Jewish social justice sector clients. Ginna serves on the boards of Bend the Arc, where she was previously chief strategy officer, Women's March, and Jewish Story Partners. Can we all give a round of applause to Ben Lorber works as a senior research analyst at Political Research Associates. a social movement think tank where he studies and publishes on anti-Semitism and white nationalism. He is co-author of Safety Through Solidarity, a radical guide to fighting anti-Semitism, and he is a frequent contributor to In These Times magazine as well. So let's give a round of applause to Ben. All right, so let's go.
All right.
Why is this stuff so hard to talk about?
Ginny, you want to kick us off?
I can kick us off. First, I want to say thank you to Ari, and in these times, it's really awesome to be in sort of like legendary halls, quite frankly. So, and thanks for all for coming out tonight on a Thursday night in the middle of September. I think the reason why it's tough to talk about this is you can really sum it up in one word, which is anti-Semitism. Whether it be the threat or the fear of it, whether it be the use of tropes that we know center so often around money and control of money, perceived control of money and use of it and access to it. I think the fear is so alive and so alive and well in our communities of acknowledging that and sort of having conversations that will open up the door to accusations of anti-Semitism. I also feel like we as a people have been afraid of the notion of any sense of Jewish collective power, and acknowledging and accepting that actually in this country right now, we have unprecedented access to resources and wealth that, quite frankly, with fascism at the door, we might not have again at this level, just to be clear. And that we could use that, and we could use that effectively to the benefit of not just our Jewish communities, but to the community in which we live. And it scares people to sort of have big conversations about topics that feel like it can come back to bite us.
Mm.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Sure.
So you've been doing this for a while in the philanthropic space. Was it always easy for you to talk about? Did you have to sort of like grow into it?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I feel like because I came into Jewish philanthropy from being involved in just general secular philanthropy, I was able and willing to talk and say things that maybe people who'd come up through explicitly Jewish philanthropy or explicitly Jewish communal work might not have been as able and willing to do. That sort of facility and comfort for me made it easy for me to always be able to say, well, this is kind of weird. This maybe shouldn't work this way. Haven't we done things differently? Yes, we have a history philanthropically, and I'm not a historian or scholar of Jewish philanthropy at all, but we know that some of the earliest foundations of it in this country were around helping us as new immigrants in many ways to be able to live and thrive, a federation system, Hebrew free loan societies. And as we began to amass more wealth and resources, we began to think, hey, we're not the only ones who need help. And we began to expand. And I think what we're seeing now in this moment in time, which is really unfortunate, is a retrenchment of a time when we were centrally concerned about Jewish survival and Jewish thriving. And we're seeing that happen right now in the very times that we're in.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Ben, you wrote a book on anti-Semitism. I guess money didn't come up at all.
No, it didn't. No, not at all. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it definitely did. I mean, first of all, I just want to, thank Jewish Liberation Fund, your crucial work in these times, your crucial work. Ginna, it's an honor to be on the panel with you. Your work at Uprise and changing the narrative of anti-Semitism is incredible. And Ari, you're a powerhouse in the world and in the world of left publishing. So it's really an honor. But yeah, I think, to add to what you were saying, Ginna, about why it's so difficult to talk about this right now, I would also just add that the issue of anti-Semitism is so polarizing and so so weaponized in our discourse and in our world right now. There's been an undeniable rise in anti-Semitism both since October 7th and before that, with the rise of the MAGA movement, right? The forces of MAGA, which are knocking at the doorstep of the presidency right now and are continuing to build power in this country, have really had anti-Semitism as one form of oppression at their core, right? We've seen the rise of George Soros, conspiracy theories, white nationalists, and other attacks on Jewish communities. Since October 7th, we have seen a real rise in anti-Semitism, and related to Israel-Palestine. A lot of it is caused by the right, some of it is caused by the left. It's all over our political discourse, but the issue of anti-Semitism in this country is also incredibly weaponized against the movements for justice that we desperately need. The movements to end the genocide, the movements for a ceasefire, for an arms embargo that we desperately need in this country, are frequently attacked with these accusations of anti-Semitism. Free speech is being shut down. There's being progressive organizations who are being investigated with terrorism charges, all in the name of Jewish safety. And I think, Jewish philanthropy and the Jewish institutional landscape as a whole is playing a role in this weaponization alongside a lot of Christian nationalist actors, alongside the bipartisan political establishment. And I don't think very much of this makes Jews any safer, right? But the issue of anti-Semitism is very live right now, as we all know. And so I just wanted to kind of set that, from the outset as we think about why this is hard to talk about right now.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned the landscape a little bit. And so let's dig into that a bit. And Ginna, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the landscape looks like to you right now.
In this moment
Yeah.
of Jewish philanthropy, it's doesn't look very good for justice. I mean, from liberal to progressive to left, all of the organizations and people who do organizing and do work in that arena are really facing a loss of support and funding from institutions within Jewish philanthropy who historically would have funded movements for justice, movements for environmental justice, racial justice, housing justice, economic justice. All of these things were actually, the Jewish social justice sector grew so much in the 80s and 90s through Shafa Fund and Jewish Funds for Justice and Nathan Cummings. And, some of those folks, Nathan Cummings is still doing great funding, but a lot of other funders are not stepping up and funding our movements the way they should, partly because, especially in this moment where we're seeing what Ben has alluded to and mentioned, is the sort of this fear around anti-Semitism, who's using it, who's fueling it, and confusion means, hey, I'm concerned that these folks, that group, doesn't really have Jewish interests at heart. So even though we've all been in the streets and at protests and in calls of the legislature and Congress on bills for housing or bills for other economic justice issues, because of this, lights out. I can't be in community and relationship and support with organizations or with people who I believe have an opinion on a particular issue that I don't agree with. And for me, it feels like, on the one hand, I sort of understand the sort of historicity of that feeling of we've got to turn inward and the only people we can count on is us. I get it. And I just feel like it's not smart. It's just not strategic. Even if that's where your heart is telling you to go, there's not enough of us. There's not enough Jews everywhere Jews are in this country to keep us safe by ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not enough of us in any state legislature to pass a bill that we would want. We just need each other. It's just fundamental that in order to get things done, we need each other. And it feels really hard to watch our Jewish philanthropic institutions sort of fall prey to the divisive tactics that we see happening on the right.
Yeah. And I think not only is this, really corroding the internal Jewish landscape and our Jewish commitments to racial and social justice, I also worry that this Jewish philanthropic turn to the right is aligning parts of our institutional landscape quite literally with rising white Christian nationalism, right? And I'm going to tell a story about that. I recently did a piece looking at the role that the Jewish right in the U.S. is playing in attacks on DEI on campuses, right? Ever since the right has been gunning after DEI really since the George Floyd uprising, right? As DEI programming has expanded across the country as one way to begin to address systemic racial inequity and white supremacy in this country. And since October 7th, the right has found a new language to attack DEI on campuses and across our society, and that's by saying DEI is anti-Semitic, right? DEI efforts to create a diversity, equity, and inclusion are making Jews unsafe, right? Because it's coded as leftist, because it's coded as pro-Palestine, right? And we've seen the Jewish right and the Jewish philanthropic right playing a role in this. There's an op-ed by a guy named Mark Cherendoff, who heads the Maimonides Fund, right? This was in January, and he basically outlined a philanthropic strategy for major Jewish funders, and he said we need to take over universities. He literally said we need to stack the boards of universities and mobilize Jewish donors to make transformational gifts and re-engineer these universities to shut down DEI and to shut down SJP, to shut down any student or faculty organizing for Palestinian rights. And he modeled this after Ron DeSantis's takeover, right, of universities. Yeah.
Can you repeat that though? Like, say what?
Yeah.
Repeated it like the money quote about taking over universities.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't think he said the words Jewish power in that piece, but he's absolutely figuring out a way to marshal, organize, and mobilize Jewish funds to exert Jewish power on institutions in a supremacist way, which is highly troubling.
Yeah. My favorite line from that piece was, we should expect that the Chronicle of Higher Education is going to call this a right-wing takeover, right? So he knew, right? But what's happening there is he's saying, hey, Jewish institutional world and philanthropists, let's align with the white Christian nationalist attack on racial justice. Let's align with the very MAGA forces who are trying to dismantle our multiracial democracy right now, all in the name of keeping Jews safe. So it's really it doesn't keep Jews safe. If we have to say that here, I think we're in agreement there. Yeah.
So may I ask, what, so Ben is deep in with the MAGA world and tracks and stuff that I don't ever want to have to see or read, and so thank you. But what's the end game for the right? When they're going to actively align themselves with anti-democratic authoritarian forces, what do they think is going to happen when they win?
The Jewish right in particular, or the right in general?
Jews. What do they think will happen to
the MAGA
Jews in the United States when and if an anti-democratic?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, there's white nationalists in that coalition who obviously imagine a very dark, future for American Jews, right? But I also think that there's many high-ranking and more powerful members of the MAGA movement who basically want to engineer a world and a future in the US that looks unrecognizable to the liberal order that's kept, that's allowed American Jews to thrive, or at least to imagine the possibility of thriving. The order that's allowed every minority group in the US to at least imagine the possibility of justice and democracy, right? They want to, roll back the abortion rights that are part of Jewish religious law, and that, allow folks with uteruses control over their bodies. They want to roll back the separation of church and state and enshrine a Christian supremacist vision of order in this country that relegates all non-Christians in various ways, and really anyone who doesn't conform to a Christian, a fundamentalist, really ultra patriarchal, quote unquote biblical worldview to second-class status, right? They want to basically roll back the gains made since the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. They want to roll back voting rights. Essentially, it's a long-term game that the right has been at for decades now.
That's the right. So why would we think that in that world we're safer? That's what that's what I'm having trouble grasping. What about that world is appealing?
I mean, I think there are some parts of the Jewish institutional and philanthropic landscape that don't quite know who they're getting in bed with, right? They kind of think it's a short-term, bargain to keep Jewish students safe, right? To fight what they think of as is anti-Semitism in the short term. But you also have at least, I'd say 20% of the American Jewish community who supports that, that vision, the Jewish right, portions of the Orthodox community, right, basically support the Christian nationalist a vision of illiberalism and control over women's bodies and and suppressing trans rights, LGBTQ rights. So I think there's a portion of American Jews who do think that'll keep them safe. There's a portion of American Jews who think the pro-Israel politics are worth it, right? And then there's a portion of the American Jews who I think don't quite know what they're getting into. Yeah. So.
What kind of scale are we talking about here? Because there might be like a perception that we got the Maimonides Fund. That's one thing happening. It's not really that much. Like, what kind of scale are we talking about here in the philanthropic space?
That's a really good question, and I wouldn't feel comfortable like specifically naming particularly any phenomenon since October 7th because it's just so recent and new. And what I'm able to say is I work with a number of both progressive movement groups and Jewish social justice sector groups, and everyone, they're all concerned that they're just one bad Twitter post away from either a major funder pulling a major gift institutionally, an institutional funder saying, I didn't like the way that employee said this comment on a thing, or an individual donor who might have a 5-figure or a larger gift that is now in jeopardy because they saw someone who works at the organization say or do a thing, or the organization didn't say or didn't do a thing. And it just seems so unrighteous to be willing to forego the real work to get to the place where we all want to go, where these donors actually are like, I support environmental justice, I support LGBTQ rights, but because that happened, I'm gonna take $50,000 away from you. Like who does that?
Yeah,
It seems like the most un-Jewish thing in the world to me. And I can understand disagreeing on a number of different topics and issues, but I can't understand treating people and our future that way.
Yeah, definitely. I'd also say, this is also a function of our post-Citizens United world. It's also a function of, the deficit in democracy, not only in the broader US, but in our American Jewish institutions, right? Our, mainstream institutions have in many ways been hollowed out. In previous decades, I know scholars like Matt Berkman and Lila Cohen Berman have talked about this. Our institutions used to be a lot more democratic. There used to be some methods of grassroots participation, imperfect as they were. But I think in recent decades, right, mirroring broader trends in American society, there's been the rise of mega donors who exert disproportionate control over the agendas our institutions set, and we also see that
Jewish mega donors.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I remember there was I used to do money and politics work, and a couple of decades ago, one of the organizations that does money and politics work was sort of trying to figure out who are the big donors, who's got the most money, who are the most individual donors in a Citizens United era, right? Like what's going on here? And they were like, oh, they ran the numbers, and it's like, oh shit, there's too many Jews on this list. Like, we don't want to put this out because anti-Semitism. And it was true, right? There were a number of Jewish donors at the top of the lists of donors, period. And like, it's true and real. And I think I just want to underscore that Citizens United effect and impact, because it is not only in the political realm anymore. Actually, we are actually seeing it exactly show up in our own private philanthropy too.
Yeah. So I mean, in a lot of ways here, right? Like we're talking about democracy, right? Which we supposedly live in, at least for like a couple of months right now. But let's dig into it like a little bit more. Like, how do you see this as an assault on democracy, more than just like our institutions are becoming increasingly anti-democratic? How do we see this as an assault on democracy?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think, like I said, we're in a moment where the possibility of a multiracial democracy in our country is under threat. And I think, polling has shown the majority of American Jews do broadly believe in liberal values. But the problem is that those values and those priorities aren't being represented at the top by our institutional, leadership, right? It's very undemocratic in our institutions in that way. And so, the federation structure, major communal organizations are really, really willing to work with the right to suppress free speech, to suppress the right to protest, to suppress academic freedom, right? When they're considering these anti-BDS bills, they're considering repressive definitions of anti-Semitism, like the IHRA definition, which really is a pretext to roll back speech rights, to kneecap progressive movements, right? And since October 7th, we need progressive movements. We need a left-wing flank in this country. We need the right to dissent and the right to say that the U.S. foreign policy should be drastically different now more than ever. And I think at this pivotal moment, most of our institutional landscape in the American Jewish community is lining up with an anti-democratic agenda that's not only on the right? It's also very much in the Democratic Party and in mainstream liberal institutions. Yeah.
And I think, and it's interesting because a lot of mainstream, more centrist institutional Jewish leaders, I think, have looked at activity in the Jewish community post October 7th and oh, I'm hearing articles about synagogues getting ready for all of the new Jews, these high holidays, who have felt invigorated somehow. And it's they're not all going to your synagogues. Did you notice that if not now, and JVP also experienced their most successful periods of growth? If I'm correct, am I correct on that data point still? In the same period of time. And so these institutions that purport to reflect our community didn't before October 7th, and I think do it less so now, and yet they are still the leaders, they are still the voices that we hear and see, and they're still the ones who are powering Jewish work, and they're just not powering Jewish social justice work as much as they could be.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, we see that anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism is tied in with the rise of anti-Blackness, the rise of anti-LGBTQ bigotry, the rise of anti-immigrant xenophobia, the rise of wealth inequality, right? In our country. And so when our mainstream institutions really side with the right here and work to repress in democracy, they're fanning the flames of the very forces that are causing the rise of anti-Semitism, right? They say they're protecting Jewish safety, right, by repressing, pro-Palestine speech. They say they're doing it to keep Jews safe in the U.S. and Israel, but they're bolstering the reactionary forces that are dividing our communities, isolating our communities, and putting us in danger. And I think the irony there is important to underlie. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we can, for folks here, break it down a little bit explicitly how this is happening. So we have the example for the Maimonides Fund here, but elsewhere, how is it exactly happening in the philanthropic space that we have either foundations or donors, sets of donors or major donors that are pushing this, that are weaponizing anti-Semitism? How is it exactly happening from point A to point B to point C?
Well, I think for most grantees and organizations whose operating budgets are mainly filled by institutional donors, foundations, and the like, they're having experiences with these institutions where I've heard some folks have been asked to sign loyalty pledges, and that they won't villainize or demonize the state of Israel in communication. So there's expectations, there's an interest in silencing any type of critical speech. So that's a piece. So you're an organization, it's oh, I can either sign this loyalty pledge and say that I won't ever speak about negatively about the state of Israel, or I can keep this $50,000 grant. And when your budget is $300,000, that's a lot of money. So there are pieces, there are steps like that are happening. Also, what's happening is grantees are being, people are watching their social media, people are watching their communications and expecting them to say or do a thing that they may find challenging or problematic. They may view anti-Semitism a different way than a particular funder, and that might say, well, wait a minute, let's talk about this. I know so many organizational leaders who have spent so many hours pre-October 7th, post-October 7th, defending staff members and their own like work outside of their Jewish institutions, because those staff members' work might be considered untoward. It might be volunteer, it might be paid, but it might be something that's challenging for a funder. And it's like, this person, this CEO who runs this organization has an employee, 24, 25, 30-year-old, who knows? They say something on Twitter that is challenging. And so then this leader spends another day, a day and a half, talking to funders, talking to donors, trying to convince them this person is in it for the work. Let them think what they want to think in their outside time. They're here putting in the hours and the heart and the blood that we need them to for this cause. And you're going to say that it's so objectionable to you that you would deprive us the ability to do the work, which it just doesn't seem right to me. And these are conversations that are happening. Leaders are being forced to spend time, energy, effort, and resources defending principles and practices that we should not, as Jews, have to ever defend.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard so many of those stories, and we also, have seen, right, in the news cycle, high-profile Jewish donors of major universities, like Bill Ackman at Harvard University, who, who organized, other major donors, right, not all Jewish, but predominantly Jewish, pro-Israel, donors to pull funding, or threatened, to pull funding, unless these universities would suppress Palestine solidarity, organizing. And, we saw people like Bill Ackman, right, make the transition. In October and November, he was like, I'm pulling my money. By December, he was like, we have to dismantle DEI completely. He was completely in bed with Chris Rufo and the entire project of the right that's dead set on dismantling DEI. And in the last few months, he's come out and endorsed Trump, right? So we've seen this liberal to right-wing pipeline, and that itself feeds into anti-Semitism, right? We've seen many cases of non-Jewish students at universities who, if their speech is suppressed, if their organizing is suppressed in the name of keeping Jews safe, even if it's not Jewish, folks who are doing it, even if it's non-Jewish university administrators who say that, in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, we need to shut down your organization. We need to curtail your ability as a Palestinian student to protest, U.S. dollars being sent to bomb Gaza. That feeds into anti-Semitism. That can feed into notions that the Jewish power is the force lurking behind the scenes, suppressing speech. That's obviously not true, right? It's American Jews play a role, but we have to also remember the American ruling class beyond the Jewish community has its own interests in suppressing pro-Palestine speech, in supporting Israel. But when we let that ruling class speak in the name of Jewish safety, that puts our own community in danger. The last thing I want to say, in hearing you speak just now, Ginna, it struck me that our institutions are suppressing our speech at the same moment that the Jewish left is growing by leaps and bounds. We're seeing all these new organizations forming, new Havara, new Havarot, new institutions like Halakhic Left, so many others, new independent, minyanim, and prayer spaces and justice movements. So, future generations of American Jews, young Jews, Jews of all ages, know this is BS, know we need a new alternative. And so, like, our institutions have to catch up with us, or
I think that's part of the reason why we can't expect them to. We can't expect the current institutions who are in positions of power and influence right now to do that, because it is not in their interest to fund an opening of the gates,
Mm.
right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, I was just doing some learning today, and I'm gonna get this all wrong, even though it's a very popular Talmudic reference around Rabbi Gamliel, who was, you know, sent out of the study hall because he had rules, very strict rules about who could enter the study hall. And he was like, your insides have to match your outsides. And so whatever, you take that how you will. But what that meant was a lot of people were not qualified to enter the study hall.
Mm.
And when he was removed from his position of leadership, and they no longer were holding to everyone's got to have their insides match their outsides,
Mhm.
everyone came, and they had to add 400 or 700 benches because people wanted to learn. And so supposedly afterwards, he was like, wait a minute, was I the person keeping people from Torah?
Mm.
And so I feel like American Jewish institutions are afraid to allow the gates to be open.
Mm.
And so we're not going to be willing to fund the new cover, the new programs, the new minyanim, the new, like that's not where
Mm.
there's a fear of
Mm.
opening those gates and opening those doors to the study hall. And so part of what feels really important to me is, as we grow as a progressive Jewish left and these numbers grow,
Mhm.
then we have to actually figure out how to resource ourselves
Mhm.
and identify the people of capacity and wealth and interest and alignment with what we consider traditional American Jewish values,
Mm.
know that we're here, and there are places where their money can go. And there are places that will be happy to take, you know, you're not used to Jewish giving, you don't know political giving. We've got some places for you
Mm.
to know,
Yeah.
and some work to be done if you want the future that I think you want.
Yeah.
You're touching on something too there, though, that is, you know, I find that I'm sure we all do, like a bit heartbreaking, right? Which is we've got these folks that are often, you know, fairly young, working in American Jewish institutions. They care so deeply about Jewish communities. They care so deeply about Judaism, the future of Judaism, and they're either being pushed out, or they're not finding it a place that is comfortable to work at all, not finding that it's aligned with their values. Meanwhile, we have this, you know, explosion of new spaces that is still, you know, seriously under-resourced right now. So there's not a lot of jobs out there that are available for people. I'm kind of wondering what people are supposed to do right now, and like people that of a new generation that really care deeply about rebuilding Jewish community right now. How do folks operate?
I mean, the first thing I'll say is not to be corny, but there's a way in which the revolution will not be funded and is never funded, right? So I think we are doing our work right now to build the institutions of the future, to build the networks and the relationships and the movements that we need you know, there's ways in which getting a foundation of funding or becoming a nonprofit might hamper you know, some of the more radical work that can be done. So I want to name that, while also naming the real reality that our movements also very much need to be resourced sometimes. You know, I say that with a lot of privilege as someone who gets paid, you know, broadly speaking, to do social justice work. We need resourcing to sustain our institutions. But I do have a lot of hope that the future is being built. It'll just take a while and it'll lag behind a bit, I think, because of the mainstream is still very well funded, and the endowments of folks are going to last a long time, and to keep that consensus. Yeah.
And to be fair, also,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to be fair, you also get paid to look at Chris Rufo's tweets all day, and so there's no amount of money.
I would say the other thing to do now is to care.
Mm.
That I think that no matter what happens in November, we will need to be very willing to initiate and power caring for each other, no matter who wins. And that's going to be practice that will be useful here, now, and in the future. And it's definitely something that we can work on at this moment.
Yeah. And I also think, caring, obviously, intersectional caring, right? Caring across identities and constituencies and communities. I think so much of what the post-October 7th institutional Jewish world is doing is cutting relations between Jews and other movements for justice, right? Cutting relations, defund, pulling funding from Black Lives Matter, pulling funding from migrant justice organizations, pulling funding from LGBTQ work, and of course, our Jewish community is intersectional and multiracial and composed of folks from every identity, right? And so the more that we can counteract that on the grassroots level by making our fight against anti-Semitism, intersectional, by building relationships, by tracing the connections, right, between fighting anti-Semitism and saving our democracy and fighting for migrant justice, fighting against xenophobia now more than ever, right? The more that we can build relationships, right, between all of our communities and all of our causes, right, on the ground, we can counteract some of the isolation, some of the burning of bridges that's being pursued by so much of our leadership.
Thanks for that. Jordan or Rachel, I also have no idea how much time we have left, so you should.
It's 8 p.m.
Okay, great. So we'll do a little bit more and then we'll do some Q&A here. Ginna, you work explicitly in political spaces here as well. And so we talked a little bit about external pressure on political spaces, but I'm wondering how it looks actually from within political spaces here and how you're able to navigate this.
You mean like, say it again, like, when
So-
you say political spaces, that's a very big term.
It is.
So do you mean like, how am I seeing, for example, Been the Arc, like a political organization navigate
Correct.
this fear?
Yeah.
Everyone is worried. Everyone who gets money from an institutional Jewish funder is concerned that their ability to do the work that both the funder and the organization agree on is the work is put in jeopardy by these external forces. So like there is this fear, and what that means is organizations have to spend so much time in stewardship, like and look, all money is about relationship, and so that's not, wouldn't be that they wouldn't do those things, but it requires so much more energy and time to be able to be in communication constantly in a mode of being concerned that a funder could decide, you know what, actually, I'm concerned that you spend too much time with this group or too much time on this issue or too much time here or there. And that's not where I want to spend my resources. Now, to be clear, every donor and every funder has that right to say, I'm either in alignment with what you're doing or I'm not in alignment. I think the challenge is when the alignment is still there, but there is a difference of opinion on another issue. And that feels really, really hard. And so organizations are definitely grappling with navigating and sort of towing a line of being able to do the work and not be afraid to scare a donor, that it's necessary and important for the work getting done. Thankfully, I mean, there are organizations who have not had funding pull, some folks are still, doing well with their Jewish institutional funders, I think. And the ones that haven't are waiting and are concerned that it may become true. And as we're seeing more and more funders sort of retrench, that might become more of a threat. I think the other piece is not just funding the Jewish social justice sector, but also what it means for Black and brown led organizing. Like Ben was mentioning, Black Lives Matter. But it's not just Black Lives Matter. I mean, like which is, a national federation at this point, but like there are local organizations in states and counties who are doing work, and a $25,000 grant being pulled from one of those groups in my hometown might as well shut the doors. That's significant if that is a trend that we continue to see. And so we're not only seeing a Jewish social justice sector being fearful of losing funding to do really meaningful, important work that is beneficial to our communities and other communities and democracy, but that local organizations are seeing the same thing happen too. They're led by Black and brown folks. One of the things I think about a lot is that we don't just have one election in this country, we have 51, like we have 50 state elections. And so when we think about work that needs to get done to bring about what we need, it's got to be done in 50 different places. And so that is, when we think about local level groups not being able to do that work, then you see almost a potential outsized impact on the ability for justice to be done in places where it actually can. Because we're also seeing not a lot of movement or activity at the federal level. So states are where things are happening in so many ways. And so thinking about what the money means for states and local work and local organizing is something that I think about a lot.
We're seeing it a lot in reproductive justice spaces
Yep.
like that too. So it's been pretty heavy, real doom and gloomy. Let's talk about some wins. We don't talk about wins enough on the left. Where are we seeing philanthropy come in and actually help move the compass more towards justice here? Are there any examples that you all point to that you're generally highlighting?
Ooh, I feel like if I start naming names, I'm gonna not name the right names. I'm afraid of naming the names.
Describe in general, maybe.
Funders who are willing, a few things, I think, few trends in philanthropy that I think are happening and that I really like to see, that are larger than just Jewish community. One, giving organizations multi-year general operating support grants. So giving organizations like, here's some money, go do a thing for a good chunk of time, because we know you can't do shit in a year or 2 years or 3 years. How many years do you think it takes for a bill in a state legislature to go from its first introduction to actually being signed by a governor? Gotta guess a 4. I think it's more than that. I actually don't know the answer anymore, but I think it's 7. So yep, there we go. I think it's 7. So when an investment long-term, when it's, when an investment that is long-term makes a lot of sense, it enables organizations to be creative and not be sort of tied to chasing money all the time, and lends itself to more success, I think. So that's a trend that is great. I think another trend for organizations that's great is not making them write a treatise to get money. Like you can ask some questions, but they don't need to write a book. Like you want to give them money, you ask them to write a grant. Like, why make it hard? That feels like a good thing, a good trend in philanthropy too. Yeah, those feel like good things.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak less to the philanthropy space, but more just the, the spirit that I would want to see animating in Jewish philanthropy, I think, is recognizing how high the stakes are in this moment, and recognizing what it means to pull back support from and commitment to racial justice work or migrant justice work or LGBTQ justice work. I think, we talk a lot in the book about how the fight against anti-Semitism is inherent, tied in to the fight for vibrant, pluralist, queer, feminist, multiracial democracy, and really, tied into the fight of ending wealth inequality, really building a world beyond capitalism, building a world where we don't even need to one day, talk about a foundation funding for justice, because we live in a fundamentally just, and well-resourced, society to begin with. I know that can be very idealistic, but, for the Jewish philanthropic world to also see that investing in racial justice, investing in democracy, investing in protecting all communities is investing in Jewish safety, right? Both because Jews are part of all communities, and because Jews will only be safe in open societies. Jews will only be safe in liberal and pluralistic and just societies. And keeping our eyes on that prize means that if some of us are on a journey of unlearning our Israel politics, or if some of us are made deeply uncomfortable or even disturbed by something a grantee is saying, they can maybe have a conversation, and they can maybe be open to having their opinions challenge. If they encounter real anti-Semitism, which does happen, they can have a conversation and give that grantee the opportunity to maybe do teshuva, and not just rely on the punitive solutions like firing employees or drawing red lines around speech. Right, there could be more of a commitment to staying in coalition, staying in partnership, even when it's messy and complicated, instead of just pulling funding, which is really horrific, not only to the grantee but to our broader project of saving our democracy and building the coalition. So that's what safety through solidarity means, right? Is recognizing that we are only safe together. And so it's not walking away from those relationships, but it's strengthening them. It's getting in it together. And that's really the opposite of the approach that you've been describing, but it's what we need.
One more question before a Q&A here. Someone was wearing a JFreg Diasporism shirt back there. Oh, excellent, excellent. Tell us why you're wearing the shirt. Tell us why you care about Diasporism.
I feel like Chicago, not New York, Chicago is my home. It's been my home for generations upon generations. And like, people say that Israel is the only place where Jews are safe. We see that that isn't true. I don't think Israel makes me any safer as a Chicago Jew. And I think Chicago being a strong and vibrant community for everyone who lives here does make me safer. It makes my whole community safer.
Thanks so much for sharing that. So Ben and Ginna, I'm curious, we are seeing a renewed interest in rising thoughts about diasporism. People are wearing t-shirts to that in these times, and things like, and I'm curious how you're thinking about this increase in interest in diasporism with what we've been talking about philanthropy.
What a juicy question.
Diasporism emergent, like that's one hell of an emergency question.
I know, I'm sorry, it was off script.
I think that the world where diasporism has a strong, like it's being received, it's being felt. I'm reading The Necessity of Exile right now, which is remarkable. And talks about exactly that. Essentially shows like argument is a counter Zionism if you haven't begun to read the book. And I feel like that the notion that sits underneath that is a widened aperture that sits underneath a different type of philanthropy too. So both of these concepts, like both expanding our view of what philanthropy is, who a philanthropist is, and what they do and what they can support, seems to me to be very aligned with the idea that there isn't just one place that's safe for us. There isn't just one way to be that's best for us. There isn't just one place to be that's best for us. And that sort of diversity of views and possibility seem really well connected to me.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I mean, I would add that, so often the story that we hear about anti-Semitism, growing up in our communities is that it's an eternal hatred. It's baked into our society. It's, always been there. It's always going to be there. And there's really nothing that we can do to end it except to kind of batter down the hatches and, turn inwards and, relevant to this, context, support our own, causes, flee from community and relationships. And I think a lot of that fear, a lot of that, trauma response, a lot of that outmoded approach to Jewish safety, lies behind the atrocities that we're seeing in Gaza right now, lies behind the worldview that support for Israel at any cost is what's going to keep Jews safe, right? Lies behind the worldview that that we have to ally with state power, state repression, or that we have to use philanthropic power, to fight anti-Semitism, how we define it. And I think ideas like diasporism and many other things of that nature are really pointing to like a fundamentally different vision of Jewish safety that's not founded on isolation or building higher walls, but is founded upon deepening our bridges and realizing that we're all in it together, and that we can actually fight anti-Semitism, and that we can imagine ending it where we live, in the places that we live, among the other people that make up this world, through building struggles together, through linking our different struggles and envisioning a shared horizon of collective liberation. So I think leaning into that is the approach that we need, and it really runs diametrically opposed to a lot of the priorities of mainstream Jewish philanthropy that we're talking about. But it's so important to have orgs like Jewish Liberation Fund that are out there really using philanthropy to embody that approach. So that's what inspires me about being here in conversations like this, and about all the movements that we're building right now.
Thanks. Let's give Ben and Ginna a hand. Anybody got some questions? Go ahead.
Pass your mic.
All right.
Actually, get some feedback online that I haven't heard it. So, you might have to stand up actually.
Hi, my name is Nia. First of all, Ginna, I'm so glad that I was here tonight to hear you speak. You are brilliant, and I feel very lucky to be in the room with you. So thank you. I guess I have a question that's a little spicy, I guess. But so I'm not a white Jew, and I feel confused about, like, to go back to the question that you were asking, Ginna, to Ben, about like, what do right-wing Jews think is going to happen at the end of this, like if MAGA wins? And I'm wondering, just from what I've seen in the spaces I'm in, I wonder if there's something wrong with how we're talking about white Jews and how white Jews talk about themselves. Like, I'm not a white Jew, so to me, I'm confused, and I've asked my white Jewish friends this, like, when are you white? When are you Jewish? Like, do you get to choose? And like, I wonder if that is something, I mean, people don't want I get it. It's like, that's why I said it's a spicy question. But like, I wonder if we could figure out what the gap is there, because I think there's something there that's just like unsaid that could help me understand better what right-wing Jews are doing. Because I can't understand it, but I wonder if maybe I don't understand it because I'm not white. Or like seen as white. I guess I'll say that.
I want to go first because oh God. I hope my husband's not watching this. Nor see, once I say this, they're gonna forward it to him, so he's gonna see it, but he knows. So I'm married to a white Jew. And in the summer of 2020, we were having a conversation, and I was like, I forget exactly what preceded it, but what happened, the words that came out of his mouth that stunned me after being together for many, many years at this point was when he said, I'm not white, I'm Jewish. And I was like, I'm married to one of you? I was like, wow, you really hit the ball on that one. I don't know how, but okay. I was like, all right. And actually that began a research project for me that I began to wanted to investigate exactly this notion of Jews and whiteness. And what about proximity, adherence, what's the appeal of whiteness? And also, though, what I found in asking some of these preliminary questions is that there's like a discomfort with accepting whiteness, and also a reticence to accept the benefits, an explicit naming of the benefits that are bestowed upon folks who get to take advantage of that identity. So I believe you're 100% onto something, that there is something to be said about how we talk to Jews who are white, not only about Jewishness, but about like the whiteness, the intersection of the whiteness and the Jewishness. I feel like there's something there. I started that research and I have not finished it because it's hard to find money to investigate that type of topic further. But I absolutely think you're onto something in that that intersection of Jewishness and whiteness, and an understanding of oneself and one's community, and like what comes with all of that is part of a really big challenge, because my thesis is that if white Jews are unable to accept the whiteness, then that means we might not be able to keep them in the fight for racial justice. So like you have to be able to actually see your positionality in something in order to be willing to disrupt it for the benefit of everyone in it.
Yeah.
The furthest that I've been able to get in a conversation is like white guilt, and white guilt is not helpful from what I can see. And so like, I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, no, that's
a
part of the
response.
question is like, how do we have a conversation about it and allow you to not feel the guilt, because the guilt is actually one of the agents, I think, of a barrier that is really hard.
Yeah. I mean, to kind of bring this to an example, like I was talking about how the Jewish right is complicit in the fight against DEI. One of the ways that they're doing that is by launching all these lawsuits against universities.
Yep.
And one of the lawsuits at UCLA tackles exactly this question. The plaintiffs are both white Jews who are faculty at UCLA, and the lawsuit says that UCLA's DEI department forced them into a white affinity group when they didn't identify as white. It was one of these things where like, okay, all the staff should form affinity groups and investigate your privileges. And these white Jewish staffers thought it was anti-Semitic that they were asked to join a white, affinity group. And there's a quote, they were interviewed saying something like, my ancestors were killed by Nazis who didn't think I was white. So, this DEI office is, erasing my Jewish identity by forcing me. And it's complicated because obviously this person needs a more intersectional understanding.
And DEI should reflect that.
Yeah.
And accept that and understand that that's a lived experience.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, this person's white fragility was weaponized to potentially take down DEI at the entire institution. So I think it's a really, dangerous way that the right is mobilizing really white grievance of white Jews in a particular way to kind of like fold it into like a broader nationalist project. But yeah.
Okay, is it on? I have thank you very much for being here. And my buddy Ben, I'm so proud of you. Yeah, it's fun when someone you knew many years ago becomes a little celebrity. In my opinion. Anyways, I have just two things. One is, it seems to me that the question about safety in Israel, that really a bigger question is why so many Jews have accumulated wealth as a form to safety. And then the people with those fears who have accumulated that wealth are the ones making decisions to protect themselves. I mean, we are the major donors. Jews are the major donors of the Democratic Party. Our money plays a big role in many institutions. And obviously, Miriam Adelson and Trump, we use our money for our safety. We accumulate money for safety, and then we try and use it that way. So that there's a fundamental thing underneath all of this about upward mobility and safety, and that needs to be challenged. And then the second thing I wanted to ask is, I think DEI does have problems in that some anti-Semitism is often not part of DEI agendas. And I think that rather than blanketly defending or critiquing, really taking a stance that yes, anti-Semitism needs to be part of DEI, and there's been problems. It's not perfect. It doesn't, but you don't throw away the baby with the
Yeah.
bathwater. So that's all I
Yeah,
have
of
to say.
course,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah.
I mean, different baby, same bathwater though, right? Like it was affirmative action, then it was CRT,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's always gonna be something.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And I would say that the same is true for the left as a whole, right? There is anti-Semitism in our left-wing movements, just as there's anti-blackness and queerphobia and transphobia and every kind of oppression in our left-wing movements, because we're human beings who live in these unjust societies. So but the answer is not to ally with the state to basically crush the left as a means to keeping Jews safe, but it's linking up and like working with our comrades and our friends and other movements to try to educate around anti-Semitism and to try to build that intersectional awareness that we need. So I totally agree with you. There's a middle path there that's like really important. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
We're gonna go to Mr. Pace, this is in the front row, and then we'll come to our next couple. Thanks for the great talk. I think further along the first question about deconstructing the idea of Jewish power and sort of Jewish right-wing institutional turn that's happened in the last several decades, I'm wondering if one of the missing words here is class, right? That what we're really looking at is not Jewish power, but Jewish bourgeois power. And that we really should develop a class framework around thinking about what's happened to the Jewish bourgeoisie. And that rather than thinking, oh, the Jewish bourgeoisie has always been liberal, that actually what's happened is the Jewish bourgeoisie on some level, or the Jewish elite, have kind of come into their own and formed an independent alliance with a kind of multi-ethnic ruling class. And then what we really need to do as sort of Jewish social movements, whether it's AVP or if not now or whatever, or JFREG, actually has economics in their title, is sort of thinking about more of a class language to theorize some of these questions, and that actually the framework of Jewish power is actually a nationalist framework fundamentally, right? Which actually erases the fact this is not speaking in the name of Jews per se, but speaking in the name of the Jewish bourgeoisie, right? So, which I mean also aligns with questions of whiteness and imperialism and Zionism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, for instance, there was just this recent study, right, that made some rounds on Twitter about how Zionist support among Jewish students increases the richer the students happen to be, right? The richer Jewish students happen to be, which seems to be just sort of one little sort of peek under the hood about what's actually happening with the realignment of Jewish politics.
Yeah.
Wasn't class the thing that always pops up and is like, yeah, no. We can't escape it in this country, right? And like we exist as a community against the backdrop and within a capitalist structure where these things become true. So I absolutely agree that we can't abandon that as part of our analysis.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And the problem that we're all diagnosing of a small circle of Jewish philanthropists who have set the agenda is common to other communities too, right? Across many different communities, there's often like, a small bourgeoisie, elite that tends to rise, to the top and get a little wealth and get a little privilege and then strike deals with power and claim to speak for the whole community to set like a conservative agenda that doesn't really reflect the interests of most of the community. And that's, in our second gilded age, right, of massive wealth inequality in our country, that's happening now, for, across many communities and within our Jewish community and in the country at large, just like it happened, 100 years ago, right? So I think, putting it in that context is crucial. It's also why the Bund and so many other Jewish left movements understood that, an emancipatory project in the broader world is also like an emancipatory project in the Jewish community, and overthrowing the bourgeoisie of our own community is essentially an essential part, I think, of building a future beyond Zionism, building a future of diasporism or whatever we want to call it. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
All right, and these will be our last two questions, and then Ari is going to close us off with one more question to our panelists, and then I'm going to officially close us off. So no more queuing here. These are our last couple.
All right. First, glad my JFreg Diasporist shirt is appreciated. But my question, and one that's been on my mind a lot recently, is for a hypothetical organization that relies on like Zionist Jewish funding to operate in the way it does, what does a future without that funding look like? Like, what would that be?
I mean, counter anti-Zionist. I mean, like that's the short answer. That's like the flip answer to the question, which is, but it goes back to, I think, what I was saying earlier in terms of where we're seeing philanthropy be right now and how misaligned they are with so many American Jews. And it is absolutely fundamental that, did you guys hear that?
Yeah, there's a bit of an echo somewhere. Yeah.
Okay.
You're not making it up, yeah.
That we identify thank you, that we identify alternatives. Like, I don't believe, I mean, like, think about, okay. Remember when Bernie ran for president? The first time. And he was making money hand over fist from people who were energized by his campaign. Felt like he was saying, his average donation, again, don't quote me on this, was like $19. It might have even been less than that. So like there is
I knew somebody in this room would know the exact number.
right, I know. Sorry. I like actively said, I'm not gonna say 18. I'm not gonna say 18. So then I said 19. But I just feel like there is an identification of new donors, and they're not all going to be small dollar. We have to identify big money donors too. I think that's huge. Like, I mean, again, I'm going to quote somebody I don't really like to quote, but he was kind of right. Don Rumsfeld back in the day. Remember when you said, I know, but he was like, you go to war with the army you got, not the army that you want. And so like, we actually have to build a new army. And because the one we got isn't doing it for us. And so it means starting with new people. It means starting and believing that like, there are folks with interest, enthusiasm, and resources who believe in the future that we want and are not willing to sell it down the river for alignment to an agenda that's just doesn't keep us safe.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, what you're saying is we need like a new, era. We need a new era of American Jewish life that gets us out of the impasse that we're in. And I look to history again for inspiration, right? It wasn't always this way in the American Jewish world. There's probably at least one historian in the room or watching who could correct me here. But this consensus that we're calling the pro Israel
Yes.
consensus, it began in like the 80s and the 90s with the rise of mega donors and the stifling of dissent. Things look very different for American Jewish institutions in the 50s, say, when groups like the AJC and the other big three organizations whose names I'm forgetting right now, they broadly had a communal defense agenda that was a lot more quasi intersectional. They really believed that supporting civil rights, supporting a variety of causes, strengthening our democracy, fighting for racial justice would keep Jews safe, including would keep white Jews safe. Not to mention the Jewish left that has always been present and a part of American Jewish life and used to be very hegemonic only a short time ago, right? So there's different visions that have animated our very recent past and that are rising right now. So I do think this consensus is crumbling. It'll just take a while to crumble, and it won't be pretty, for a while.
And building the replacement is going to take a while too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Final question before we go back to Ari.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time tonight. I work with a lot of non-Jewish civil rights advocacy organizations, and anecdotally have talked with at least half a dozen leaders from across the country who are feeling this tension between staff and the communities these organizations say they serve, demanding support of a free Palestine, and leaders or board members or funders who are trying to promote pro-Israel policies. And I'm curious for non-Jewish allies who might also be feeling this tension. Do you have any advice or thoughts as someone who is sometimes the only Jewish person in that space? Throwing a curveball to close it out.
Yeah.
So to clarify and confirm, what can be useful for these local groups in their conversations with Jewish funders and or donors, not Jewish staff at other institutions, right?
Correct.
Right.
They're feeling pulled between staff and community.
And their own funders who are not necessarily the same. I mean, I will underscore what Ben said about conversation and relationship and just being willing to be in conversation and a few things. One, go in, like lower your expectations and then lower them again and then lower them again. And operate from a place of empathy and respect, understanding that there's a lot of different reasons why funders and donors hold the positions that they do, and it's not without legitimacy and validity. And I may disagree wholeheartedly, but I understand where folks are coming from. And as long as you don't call me names, we can talk. And be willing to be in that stance of being able to empathize and respect with that viewpoint. Is what I would recommend.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add because I really haven't spent much, I feel like Ginna's a real philanthropy expert here and I haven't been in the spaces very much, but I totally agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. We're going to close out just a couple of notes real quick. So there's a lot of discussion about New College earlier. Our investigative editor at In These Times, Catherine Joyce, will have a major feature story on New College in the next issue of In These Times, which will be coming out in mid-October. Next week, you'll likely see a story that has to do with many of these issues around American Jewish institutions as well, including many here in Chicago. You should check out the other issues in front of you, including our current issue, which is a special culture issue that we ran. It was curated by our print editor, Sherelle Barbie. It's the first issue, I think, in These Times history that is all contributors of color as well. And so it's a really exciting issue on a lot of levels. There's a roundtable, a poetry roundtable about poetry in moments of crisis right now as well. And there's really great work from Toni Morrison and June Jordan in there as well. So thank you all so much for coming. Let's give one last round of applause to Ben and Ginna here.
And to Ari for your amazing work.
And also, it seems quite clear what our marching orders are here. Build a new world and give it all the money that you can. Right, so thanks so much. And I'm going to pass it on to Jordan to close this out.
Thank you, thank you. You know, Ben, you make me worry when you said the revolution will not be funded because I work at a funding. But you brought it back by name dropping JLF, which someone forgot to do when they have the opportunity. You guys are amazing. Thank you. I'm really inspired. So, I'll take advantage of this because we have a couple of our people who represent our grantees in the room, Scout and Alexandra. Now, I know we shout outs on Mood and Center for Jewish Nonviolence. Now, I know there was talk about grants with general operating expenses. Are there any restrictions on your grants? On the internet, for the people on the internet, they said no, they aren't. Does it feel like it? I forget the big word you used for what it feels like to write a giant, Yes, thank you. Treat us. Does it feel like that? Yes, super accessible, really supportive, and lots of transparency communication. So we do our best to fund a Jewish world, like using both the values that we want to see, funding organizations who are living by those values, and funding using the values that we would like to see. A friend of mine talks about what Jewish Liberation Fund is trying to do. Is my friend who's actually speaking on our next panel, Rabbi Lex Rofberg, and he talks about what we're, shout out, go Bruno. He talks about it, he knew about this before I even ended up with this job, but when he talks about it, he says, the federations all started out with a bunch of Jews just giving a little bit of money to make life better for the immigrants who are coming over. We have to think about it like we're starting with nothing ourselves. We don't have the institutions, just like we talked about today, but we can build them with a lot of people contributing. Earlier this year, shout out to Liz and Rachel, we raised $12,000 at a JLF fundraiser here in Chicago. That's about the size of one of our grants to a lot of different organizations. So just like that, just from a bunch of, I think it was around 70, 80 people, something like that, giving together, we were able to raise a grant for an organization. This is what we're trying to do here at JLF. I'm not, well, I am here to ask for your money, but today's not a fundraiser. Today's not a fundraiser. Save it for end of year when we come back in March, hopefully. But this is what we're trying to do. We appreciate you coming here. We appreciate you, paying the ticket price. Consider going on our website, thinking about giving. Consider talking to Liz, Rachel, or myself about what it's like to get involved with JLF and what we're trying to do. I'm really excited about this base we have growing here in Chicago. I want to see it thrive. And I'd appreciate you all coming and be a part of it. Thank you.